There are stories that never end. They simply cease, like a line interrupted in the middle of the page, like a name that disappears from the records without leaving heirs, letters, or graves. The case of the 50 horsemen of Blue Hollow Ridge is not remembered for what happened, but for what failed to happen afterward. In the winter of 1906, Blue Hollow Ridge was just a forgotten corner of the mountainous territory between Kentucky and Tennessee, a steep fold in the landscape where cattle trails, small farms, and mining paths crossed without ever becoming roads. There was no railroad station. The mail arrived twice a month, when it arrived. Silence was part of the routine, as present as the mud on boots and the cold that seeped through the cracks in the log houses. Official documents from the region are scarce. Incomplete parish records, hastily written sheriff's reports, torn pages from a county incident book. Still, names appear. 50 of them. Adult men, almost all of them experienced horsemen, farmhands, freight drivers, 2 brothers, a father and son, and at least 3 young men who were not yet 20. They were not an organized group. They were not a militia, nor a formal trading caravan. What united them was a route and a promise. Blue Hollow Ridge Loft was an elevated shed, built years earlier on a natural rock formation, originally used as a cargo shelter and resting place for animals during longer journeys. It appeared on local maps only as Blue Hill Loft, a neutral point, a place of passage. Or at least that's how it appeared in reports prior to 1906. The indirect protagonist of this story is not a specific man, but a name that recurs in the testimonies. Elias Crowder, 41, a literate freight driver known for keeping personal records in small leather notebooks. Part of what is known today comes from these fragments, stained pages found years later in a metal box kept by a distant relative. Crowder describes Blue Hollow Ridge as a place where the wind seems to stop to listen. He was not alone on that journey. According to the list reconstructed by researcher Harold W. Minton in 1932, exactly 50 men entered the trail that led to the loft that week in November. The weather had changed abruptly. Witnesses speak of low fog, poor visibility, and longer than usual nights. Nothing extraordinary for the season, but enough to delay travel and force unplanned stops. Still, everyone pressed on. The families were not surprised by the immediate absence. 2 days, 3, 4. Delays were common. Animals fell ill. Trails collapsed. What was not common was the collective silence. 50 men without a single message, without a horse returning alone, without a body found. In the county archives, there is a short note, written in lighter ink, almost erased by time. Last visual confirmation, group entering the east trail of Blue Hollow Ridge, heading toward the loft. No subsequent notes, no recorded departure. And the most disturbing thing is not what was lost, but a marginal detail found in the local store's book. That week, no one requested return supplies, as if no one had planned to return. To understand what happened at Blue Hollow Ridge, one must first understand how people lived there and how they left. The region consisted of small, isolated properties separated by miles of dense forest and rugged hillsides. Families rarely saw more than the same faces throughout their entire lives. Trust was built on habit, not promises. A man was known by the way he cared for his horse, by his punctuality in deliveries, by his respectful silence at other people's tables. Elias Crowder lived by this predictability. His notebooks describe repeated routes, trail names, practical observations about weather and terrain. Nothing in them suggests impulsiveness. On the contrary, Crowder was described by neighbors as cautious, methodical, someone who only accepted trips when he was sure of his return. Still, in the weeks leading up to November 1906, there are subtle changes in his records. The notes become more spaced out. Some sentences end abruptly. On one page he writes only, "Hollow Ridge again," many interested this time. Other reports confirm this movement. The loft was once again being mentioned in local conversations. Not as a shelter, but as a temporary meeting point for horsemen who crossed the region by different routes and intended to continue together to the next valley. Traveling in a group meant safety, more eyes, more weapons, more voices against the loneliness of the mountains. What stands out is the diversity of the group. There were men who had never met before. Some came from the north, others from the south. They shared no family ties or formal contracts. The only agreement was tacit: arrive at the loft, spend the night, continue together at dawn. Testimonies collected decades later reveal small oddities. One wife recalls that her husband saddled his horse earlier than usual and avoided long goodbyes. A young man told his father that the hollow folk seemed too determined. A village merchant noted in his cash book that he sold more supplies than usual to men who did not seem to be planning a long journey. None of this was considered relevant at the time. The past, seen up close, rarely presents itself as an omen. The loft itself was simple: a thick wooden structure raised above the ground on stone pillars. An open space below, closed above, used to store cargo and protect animals from the night cold. There were no sophisticated locks, no security system, just heavy doors that creaked in the wind. Some residents avoided the place, not out of overt fear, but out of discomfort. They said the hill muffled sounds, that the echo behaved strangely there. Vague observations, common in regions where geography shapes perception. On the eve of departure, several families reported the same behavior. Men checking harnesses more than once, checking weapons unnecessarily, watching the sky for long minutes. There was no panic. There was concentration. The last domestic record comes from Crowder's house. A neighbor claimed to have seen the lamplight on late into the night. When dawn broke, the house was closed. The horse was not in the stable. 50 men followed the eastern trail at different times over 2 days. Some joined along the way. Others arrived alone. All were seen entering the same narrow route that led to the top of the hill. After that, only the wind, and a broken routine that no one noticed right away, because there, disappearing for a few days was still part of life. The reconstruction of the disappearance begins in the late afternoon of November 17, 1906, not because of a specific event, but because that is the point where the accounts converge, and then diverge. The eastern trail of Blue Hollow Ridge became narrower as it climbed. Tall trees blocked the light too early, creating a constant gloom even before sunset. Indirect witnesses, men who crossed the path that week but did not continue on to the loft, reported hearing hooves echoing irregularly, as if the sound were absorbed by the hill in certain places. The first riders arrived at the loft while it was still light out. They tied their animals in the lower space, climbed the wooden ramp, and occupied the upper floor. According to later reconstructions, there was enough space for everyone there. Cramped, but functional. The smell of wet leather, old hay, and damp wood dominated the environment. Elias Crowder arrived at dusk. His last known record was probably made on the way, scribbled in haste. I arrived. Many faces. The wind has changed. Night fell without a storm. It did not rain. There was no snowstorm. The cold was expected for the season. This detail is important because it eliminates, from the outset, explanations linked to extreme weather phenomena. Men lit small lamps. Some ate. Others just sat, leaning against the walls. There is no evidence of celebration or immediate conflict. Nothing suggests panic or haste. The first sign of strangeness comes from a late testimony, collected in 1928 from a local hunter who claimed to have passed near the hill that night. He saw no light in the loft, something unusual, according to him, for an occupied shelter. He also said that the usual sounds of animals did not come from there. No neighing, no perceptible movement. Around midnight, according to calculations based on distance and time, a second group of horsemen should have reached the site. They were never seen by anyone after entering the trail. Their horses also disappeared. The silence, it seems, was absolute. There were no signs of a struggle in the surrounding area recorded later. No shots were heard that night in the nearby villages. No fires, no mass escape noticed at dawn. When the sun rose, the hill looked untouched. The loft was standing. The doors were closed. The last confirmed physical evidence was only found days later when a farmer climbed the trail in search of a lost animal. He found, about 50 meters from the loft, a dark felt hat, partially covered by leaves. Inside the brim, a name written by hand, E. Crowder. There were no recent footprints around, no drag marks, nor any signs of hasty abandonment. 50 men had spent the night there. And yet, at dawn, it was as if no one had ever been there. The absence began to be noticed on the 5th day. First, in a fragmented way, a horse that did not return, a man who did not show up for a delivery, a family that waited longer than usual. In regions like Blue Hollow Ridge, delays were tolerable. Collective disappearances were not. When the search began, there was no immediate fanfare. The county sheriff, Thomas H. Rayner, gathered a small group of volunteers and headed down the eastern trail. Records indicate excessive caution, as if he himself did not know exactly what he expected to find. The loft was locked from the inside. The doors showed no signs of forced entry. The hinges creaked as usual. Inside, there were unmistakable signs of recent occupation. Food scraps, rummaged hay, cold ashes from small makeshift fires in metal containers. There were exactly 50 sets of tether marks on the lower floor. No bodies, no sign of a mass exodus. What caused the greatest concern was the absence of tracks. On damp ground, with leaves and soft earth, it would be natural to find footprints, hoofprints, any sign of collective movement. None of this was recorded in the initial reports. The surroundings seemed to have been carefully spared from disturbance, not by design, but by circumstance. The horses were not there either. The search went on for weeks. Groups ventured into the woods, following secondary trails, ravines, and waterways. They found isolated objects: a buckle, a knife without a handle, an empty canteen, none of them in sufficient quantity to indicate a violent dispersal. Testimonies began to emerge. Some were contradictory. One resident claimed to have heard voices in the early hours of the morning, but could not say exactly where they came from. Another said he saw a lone figure coming down the hill at dawn, but never officially confirmed the report. The revelation, if it can be called that, did not come as a definitive answer, but as a recurring human pattern in the late records. Years later, while cross-referencing testimonies, researcher Harold W. Minton raised a silent hypothesis. The loft was not the end, but the point of transition. Something happened there. Not an external attack, but a collective decision precipitated by fear, misinformation, or internal conflict never documented. Perhaps a false alarm. Perhaps the suspicion of an ambush. Perhaps a man said something that was never recorded. What is known is that the group did not remain united after that night. Records from neighboring counties indicate the appearance in the following months of unidentified men without documents, working temporarily on distant farms. Some had physical characteristics compatible with those who had disappeared. None confirmed their identity. There were no mass graves. There was no documented massacre. There was only dissolution. 50 men entered together, and they disappeared not in a single event, but in a sequence of silent choices, each one erasing a little more of the trace of the previous one. The loft remained standing for decades, avoided, not out of fear, but out of respect for something that was never explained. And yet no one has ever been able to say who was the first to walk down the hill that night, or why. By 1939, when the state road finally skirted Blue Hollow Ridge, the loft was gone. Only the stone pillars remained, covered in moss, and fragments of wood scattered across the hillside, like ancient bones of a forgotten structure. Researcher Harold W. Minton was there that year. In his diary, now preserved in a private collection, he wrote that the place did not cause fear, but a kind of weariness, as if the hill had seen too much, and no longer wanted to remember. Minton wasn't looking for definitive answers. He knew that time doesn't bring back names, only patterns. What interested him was the silence in the documents, the interruptions, the gaps, the unfinished sentences. In cases like Blue Hollow Ridge, the void spoke louder than any belated testimony. None of the 50 men were officially declared dead. Without bodies, there were no death certificates. Without death certificates, there was no closure. The families went their separate ways. Some waited for years, others sold the land, others deliberately erased the names, as if forgetting were the only possible form of survival. In interviews conducted in the following decades, older residents avoided commenting on the subject, not out of superstition, but for something simpler. Admitting that men could disappear without explanation shook the notion of control that sustained life in that region. Elias Crowder's notebooks end without conclusion. The last preserved page contains only one line, written in almost dry ink. Not every road leads forward. For the historian, this phrase was never a metaphor. It was a practical record, perhaps made without awareness of the weight it would later carry. Today, Blue Hollow Ridge appears only as a name on old maps. The East Trail has been swallowed by vegetation, the Loft has become an absence, and the 50 horsemen remain where they have been since 1906, between a confirmed entry and a return that never happened. There is no clear lesson. There are no identified culprits. There is only the uncomfortable realization that sometimes history does not end with a period. It simply drifts away silently until no one notices its absence. And perhaps that is what makes certain disappearances impossible to forget. Not the mystery of what happened, but the fact that the world went on exactly as if nothing had happened.